I married a poor artist. Then I saw his bank account. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to sneak a peek at my husband's bank account. I mean, what kind of person does that? But let me tell you, when I did, when I saw that string of numbers stretching across the screen, my entire world didn't just crack, it shattered into a million pieces. This is the story of how I fell in love with a man who had nothing, only to find out he had everything and was testing me every single second of our relationship. 3 years ago, I met Leo. It was at a grimy, hole-in-the-wall coffee shop that smelled of damp wool and burnt espresso beans. I was drowning in student debt and working a dead-end administrative job. And he was an artist. Not the kind with a pristine studio in a trendy neighborhood. No, Leo was the real deal. His studio was a converted garage that leaked when it rained, and his paint-splattered jeans had more holes than fabric. He lived on a diet of instant ramen, cheap beer, and the sheer, unadulterated joy of creating. Our first date wasn't a fancy dinner. It was a walk along the river at dusk, sharing a single, slightly squashed sandwich he'd made, and I was completely, utterly smitten. Falling in love with Leo was like falling in love with a force of nature. He saw the world in colors I didn't know existed. He'd point out the particular shade of ochre in a sunset over the industrial park, or the deep cerulean blue in a puddle after a rainstorm. He was passionate, brilliant, and so beautifully disconnected from the material world. Money, to him, was just a necessary evil to buy more canvases and tubes of paint. He sold a piece every few months for just enough to cover his share of the rent and groceries, and the rest of the time, he bartered. A landscape for a new pair of boots, a portrait for a month's supply of coffee. He was a modern-day bohemian, and I was his willing acolyte. When we decided to get married, it was a courthouse affair. I wore a simple sundress, and he wore his one clean button-down shirt. We didn't have rings for the first 6 months, not because we didn't want them, but because the idea of spending hundreds of dollars on a symbol of our love when that money could buy paint and canvas felt wrong to him. So we braided strands of leather from his worn-out journal and wore those instead. Our life was a tapestry woven from shared struggles and small, profound joys. We'd dance in our tiny living room to the crackle of a vintage record player he'd fixed himself. We'd make a game out of seeing who could create the most gourmet meal from a random assortment of clearance rack groceries. I loved our life. I loved him. I loved the fact that when I looked at him, I saw a pure, uncorrupted soul, a man who valued truth and beauty above all else. My friends and family didn't get it. They'd ask with thinly veiled concern if I was sure about this, about building a life with someone so unstable. But I would just smile and tell them they didn't understand. I wasn't marrying his bank account, I was marrying him. I was marrying the way his eyes lit up when he talked about composition, the way he held my hand like it was the most precious thing in the world, the way he made even the most mundane day feel like an adventure. I thought I had it all. I thought I had found a love story that was real, raw, and completely untainted by the corrupting influence of wealth. I was so proud of our beautiful struggle, so confident in the foundation of our love. I had no idea that the entire foundation was built on a lie, a secret so massive it would make everything I thought I knew about my husband and our life together a complete and utter fiction.
The first crack in the carefully constructed facade of our bohemian paradise was so small, I almost missed it. It was a Tuesday, and I'd come home from a particularly grueling day at the office to find Leo not in his studio, but in the living room, hunched over his laptop. He quickly closed it when I walked in, a gesture so uncharacteristically furtive it gave me a moment's pause. But I shook it off. He was probably just looking at a surprise for me. A few days later, he came home with a tube of paint. Not just any paint. It was a specific shade of cerulean blue, a German brand that was notoriously expensive, the kind professional artists drooled over but could rarely afford. When I asked him about it, he just waved his hand dismissively and said he'd gotten a great deal from a guy whose studio was closing down. It was plausible, I told myself, a lucky break. But the seed of a tiny, unwelcome thought had been planted in my mind. From there, the inconsistencies began to multiply, like weeds in a carefully tended garden. They were small things I would have never noticed if I hadn't been subconsciously looking for them, like the vintage Leica camera he kept on his shelf. He always said he'd found it at a flea market for $20, but one day I was browsing a photography forum and saw the exact same model, in the same pristine condition, listed for over $5,000. Or the time we were at a party, and someone mentioned a rare 50-year-old bottle of scotch. Leo, my ramen and beer husband, had chimed in with an incredibly detailed analysis of its tasting notes and the history of the distillery, leaving everyone in the room, including me, completely stunned. He'd laughed it off, saying he'd read about it in a magazine, but the knowledge was too intimate, too precise. The most jarring incident happened about a month after the paint incident. He got a phone call while we were making dinner. He stepped into the other room and I heard his voice change. It wasn't the gentle, melodic tone I knew. It was deeper, crisper, more authoritative. He was using words like liquidate assets and fiduciary responsibility. He spoke with the easy confidence of a man who was used to being in command. When he came back into the kitchen, the persona had slipped back on as easily as an old coat. He was just Leo again, my sweet, scatterbrained artist. But I had seen behind the curtain, just for a second, and what I saw didn't match the man I thought I'd married. I started to feel a strange cognitive dissonance, a dizzying sense that I was living in two realities at once. There was the life I cherished, the one of shared poverty and artistic passion, and then there was this other, shadow life, hinted at by expensive paints and secret phone calls. I felt guilty for even suspecting him. Who was I to question the man I loved? But the questions were there, buzzing in my head like a persistent fly. I tried to push them away, to rationalize them, but they were getting louder, more insisting. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my own financial anxieties were bleeding into my perception of him, but then I found the receipt. It was tucked into the pocket of his jacket when I was gathering laundry for the wash. It was from a restaurant I knew only by reputation, a place where a single entree cost more than our monthly grocery budget. The date on the receipt was from the previous Friday, the night he told me he was pulling an all-nighter at the studio, trying to meet a deadline. And there, at the bottom, was the charge for 2 people. My heart sank like a stone in my stomach. The inconsistencies weren't just weird quirks anymore. They felt like a betrayal. The receipt from the restaurant burned a hole in my pocket, and a hole in my heart. For 2 days, I said nothing. I watched him move through our small apartment, his smile as genuine as ever, his touch as tender as always, and I felt like I was living with a ghost. The man I saw was not the same man who had shared an expensive dinner with someone else. Or was he? The doubt was a corrosive acid,
eating away at the trust I had so foolishly believed was unbreakable. Every time he kissed me, I wondered if he was thinking of someone else. Every time he talked about his struggle, a bitter taste filled my mouth. I had to know. The not knowing was worse than any truth I could uncover. My opportunity came a few nights later. Leo had to run to the art supply store for more gesso, a trip he said would take an hour. His laptop was sitting open on the kitchen table, the screen glowing softly. I told myself I just wanted to see if there were any clues about who he had dinner with. Maybe a confirmation email, a chat log. I felt sick to my stomach, a voyeur in my own marriage. My hands trembled as I touched the trackpad. I opened his browser history, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was clean, suspiciously clean. There were no searches, no history, no cookies. It was like the digital equivalent of a sterile operating room. That's when I saw it. A single folder on his desktop, labeled Archives. It was the only thing that wasn't a familiar art file or a picture of us. It was locked. A password prompt popped up, mocking me. My mind raced, trying to guess the password. Our anniversary? My name? The name of his childhood dog? Nothing. I was about to give up, my face hot with shame and frustration, when a memory surfaced. It was from our first year together. He'd finished a painting he was incredibly proud of, an abstract piece that he said captured the feeling of finding light in the chaos. He'd given it a strange, poetic name, Athelred's Lament. It was an obscure, almost unpronounceable name, but it meant something to him. On a whim, my fingers flying across the keyboard, I typed it in. The folder unlocked. My breath caught in my throat. I clicked on it, expecting to find emails, maybe photos of another woman. But what I found was so much worse and so much more bizarre that my brain struggled to process it. There were no love letters. There were no incriminating photos. There were documents, dozens of them, PDFs and spreadsheets with titles like Q4 Portfolio Performance, Blackwood Family Trust Distribution Schedule, and Swiss Bank Account Asset Overview. I clicked on one of the spreadsheets, my eyes scanning the columns of numbers. The figures were astronomical. They weren't in the thousands or even the hundreds of thousands. They were in the millions, tens of millions. I opened another document, a scanned copy of a legal deed for a property in the Hamptons, and another, a stock portfolio that read like a who's who of the Fortune 500. And then I saw a name that appeared on almost every document, linked as the primary beneficiary and trustee. It was a name I recognized from the cover of Forbes magazine I'd seen in a doctor's waiting room. A legendary, reclusive industrialist named Alistair Blackwood, a man rumored to be one of the wealthiest people on the planet. And next to his name, as his sole heir, was the name of my husband, my ramen-eating, paint-stained, struggling artist, Leo Blackwood. The room started to spin, the numbers on the screen blurring into a meaningless, terrifying smear. My husband wasn't having an affair. He was something else entirely. He was a billionaire. The world went silent. The only sound was the frantic, panicked beating of my own heart. I felt like I was drowning, the sheer weight of the numbers on the screen pulling me down into an abyss of disbelief. Leo Blackwood. The name echoed in my head, a foreign sound attached to the face of the man I loved. I must have sat there for 10 minutes, maybe 20, just staring at the screen, trying to force the information to make sense. It didn't. It couldn't. This was the stuff of movies, of tawdry romance novels. It didn't happen to people like us in our leaky garage studio instant noodle life. I heard the key turn in the front door. In a panic, I slammed the laptop shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. Leo walked in, a bag of gesso in one hand and a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked from a vacant lot in the other. He saw my face, and his smile faltered. He knew. He knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. He set the flowers in the bag on the counter slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. I couldn't speak. The words were stuck in my throat, a tangled mess of betrayal and confusion. Instead, I just pushed the laptop across the table towards him. I didn't open it. I didn't have to. He looked at the closed laptop, then back at me, and a profound, soul-crushing sadness washed over his features. The confident, artistic mask he wore so well seemed to melt away, revealing a man who looked exhausted, ancient, and deeply afraid. He didn't try to lie. He didn't try to make excuses. He just sank into the chair opposite me, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He began to talk, his voice quiet and raw. He told me everything. He was, indeed, Alistair Blackwood's only son and heir. He had grown up in a world of private jets and boarding schools, of suffocating expectations, and people who only saw his last name. He said he hated it. He hated the plastic smiles, the sycophants, the endless, soulless pursuit of more. He felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage. So, on his 25th birthday, when he gained full control of a portion of his trust, he ran. He created a new identity, a new life. He became Leo, the struggling artist, a persona he had curated with as much care as any of his paintings. He chose a city where no one knew him, where he could disappear. He moved into the garage, he bought the worn-out clothes, he learned to live on nothing. And for 3 years, he had succeeded. He had built a world that was the complete antithesis of the one he had left behind. Then he looked at me, his eyes filled with a vulnerability so raw it almost broke my heart. He told me that meeting me was the best thing that had ever happened to him, but it also terrified him. He said he fell in love with me so completely, so desperately, that he had to know, he had to be sure. Our entire life together, the poverty, the struggle, the beautiful simplicity, it was all real in the sense that we were living it. But it was also a test, a final, elaborate experiment to see if I could love him, Leo the artist, without the shadow of his family's fortune looming over us. He wasn't just hiding from his past, he was actively testing my present, using his poverty as a crucible to burn away any possibility that I was a gold digger. He had watched me, studied my reactions, waited for a sign that I resented our life, that I wanted more, and I had never given him one. The expensive paint, the secret phone calls, the fancy dinner, that was him, he confessed, getting weak, slipping back into old habits, accessing his old life for small, necessary things. The dinner, he clarified with a pained expression, was with a lawyer from his family's firm, a man who had tracked him down and was urging him to come home. He hidden it from me because he was afraid of what it meant. He finished his story, his voice barely a whisper, and looked at me. The entire apartment, the life we had built, felt like a movie set, and I was the only actor who hadn't been given the script. He saw the devastation on my face, the utter sense of betrayal, and his own face crumpled. He reached across the table, his hand trembling, but stopped just short of touching mine. He asked the one question that hung in the air between us, a question heavier than any billion-dollar fortune. "Now that you know," he whispered, his voice cracking with fear, "can you ever love me again?" Can you ever love me again? The question hung in the air between us, a toxic cloud that poisoned every memory we had ever shared. The walls of our tiny apartment, once a cozy sanctuary, now felt like they were closing in on me. Every object was a lie. The worn-out couch was a prop. The second-hand dishes were a costume. The man sitting across from me, the man whose tears I wanted to wipe away, was a stranger. I didn't have an answer for him. How could I? The man I loved was a fiction, a character he had invented to see if I was worthy of the real him. The ultimate irony was that his test, his grand experiment in authenticity, was the most inauthentic thing I had ever experienced. I felt like a fool, a pawn in a game I never knew we were playing. The love I felt, which I had believed was so pure and so real, was now tainted. Was it real for him, or was I just a data point in his twisted social experiment? I couldn't breathe. I stood up so abruptly my chair scraped against the floor, the sound jarring in the suffocating silence. I mumbled something about needing air, needing space, and I fled. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I couldn't be there. I ended up at my best friend's apartment, blurting out the whole insane story between gut-wrenching sobs. She listened, her eyes growing wider and wider, until she finally just hugged me, letting me cry on her shoulder. For the next week, I stayed with her. I ignored Leo's calls, his texts, his desperate, pleading voicemails. He wasn't apologizing for the test itself, but for the pain it had caused. He said he understood if I hated him, that he would give me all the space I needed. But his absence didn't bring me clarity, it just brought a different kind of pain. I was a ghost haunting my own life. I replayed every moment of our relationship, searching for the lie. The day we braided leather rings instead of buying gold ones, was he laughing at me? The night we stayed up painting our own masterpieces on cardboard canvases because we couldn't afford real ones, was it all a performance? The more I thought about it, the more tangled my feelings became. Because the emotions I felt during those moments, the joy, the love, the connection, they felt real. They were real. But were they real for him? That was the question that tormented me. Was he just a brilliant actor, or was the struggling artist a part of him he genuinely loved, a part he was just as sad to lose as I was? I was caught in a terrible limbo. On one hand, I felt a profound sense of betrayal. He had robbed me of my agency, of my choice. He had decided for me what kind of life I should have, what kind of man I should love. On the other hand, I understood his fear. I could only imagine the pressure, the loneliness of being born into that world. His method was extreme, cruel even, but his motivation? His motivation was born from a deep, desperate desire for a love that was genuine. It was the most screwed up, romantic, and heartbreaking thing I had ever heard. After a week of agonizing silence, I knew I couldn't hide forever. I had to face him, face us. I was steeling myself to go back to the apartment to have the conversation that would either end our marriage or redefine it when a black town car pulled up to the curb. A driver in a crisp uniform got out and approached me. He didn't say a word, just handed me a simple cream-colored envelope. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a note in Leo's familiar, elegant scrawl. It read, "I know I have no right to ask, but I need to show you something. The real me. No more lies, no more tests. Just the truth. If you're willing, the car will wait. It's your choice, completely." I stood on the sidewalk, the note clutched in my hand, the black car purring patiently at the curb. This was it, the final test, but this time I was the one holding all the power. I could get in that car and step into his world, a world of unimaginable wealth and complexity. Or I could turn my back and walk away, choosing to preserve the memory of the man I thought he was, even if he never really existed. My entire future, my entire heart, depended on the choice I was about to make. My feet felt like they were cemented to the pavement. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to disappear back into my normal life and pretend this whole surreal nightmare had never happened. But another part of me, the part that still loved the man behind the lie, knew that running wouldn't solve anything. I would always be left wondering. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I walked towards the car and slid into the plush leather interior. The driver nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, and pulled away from the curb. We drove for what felt like an eternity, leaving the city behind and winding through tree-lined roads I didn't know existed. My mind was a whirlwind of possibilities. Was he taking me to his family's mansion, to a lawyer's office to sign divorce papers? The uncertainty was agonizing. Finally, the car turned through a set of imposing iron gates and down a long, private driveway. But it didn't stop at a house. It stopped in front of a building that looked like a modern art museum, all glass and steel and stark, clean lines. The driver opened my door, and I stepped out, my heart hammering against my ribs. Leo was standing at the entrance, waiting for me. He wasn't dressed as the billionaire heir or the struggling artist. He was just wearing simple, dark trousers and a soft-looking sweater. He looked nervous, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. He didn't try to touch me. He just gestured towards the building and said, "Please, let me show you." He led me inside. The space was vast and silent, bathed in natural light, and it was filled with art. Not just any art. It was a breathtaking collection that spanned centuries and genres. There were Monets and Picassos, Rothkos and Hockneys, pieces I had only ever seen in art history books. I was stunned, utterly speechless. But Leo didn't stop in the main galleries. He led me deeper into the building, to a wing that felt different. The lighting was softer, more intimate. The art here was by contemporary artists, many of whom I recognized from the local art scene. The same ones Leo used to talk about, the ones he admired for their raw, uncommercial vision. "I've been buying their work for years," he said quietly, his voice echoing in the silent space. Anonymously, I wanted to support them, to give them the freedom to keep creating without having to starve for it. He showed me piece after piece, telling me the story behind each artist, his passion and knowledge evident in every word. This wasn't the hobby of a bored rich kid. This was the life's work of a true patron of the arts, a man who was deeply, genuinely invested in the creative spirit. He led me to the final and most poignant section of the museum. It was a series of smaller rooms, and the art here was different. It was powerful, moving, and utterly unknown. These were the works of artists who had never been discovered, who had died in obscurity, their genius lost to the world. Leo had tracked down their estates, their surviving family members, and had built an entire collection dedicated to giving them a voice they never had in life. "This," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is what I've been doing with the money. This is my real work. The painting, the Leo the artist persona, that was my escape. This is my purpose." He looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to understand. My test wasn't about whether you could be poor, Sarah. It was about whether you could see. Whether you could see the value in something that has no price tag. Whether you could love a soul, not a bank account. He had been testing me, yes, but he had also been living by a code I realized I had always seen in him, even when I didn't understand it. He led me to the very last room. It was empty, except for a single golden plaque on the wall. My breath hitched as I read the inscription, "The Leo and Sarah Blackwood Wing, a testament to a love that found truth in a lie." He turned to face me then, all the pretense gone, all the masks stripped away. He was just Leo, the man I loved. "The money, the name, the family, none of it matters without you," he said, his voice breaking. "I'll walk away from all of it. I'll sign it all over to a foundation. I'll go back to the garage and be the poor artist for real if that's what it takes. I just want you. The choice is yours, Sarah. All of it, or none of it." Standing in that empty gallery, looking at the plaque with our names on it, the world finally snapped back into focus. The pieces of the last few weeks, the last few years, rearranged themselves into a new, startlingly clear picture. The man I fell in love with in that grimy coffee shop, the man who saw beauty in a puddle and danced with me in our tiny living room, was the same man standing in front of me now. The circumstances of our life had been a lie, a grand, elaborate deception. But the love, the connection we shared, that was real. I could see it now, in the passion he had for this museum, in the way he had used his immense fortune not for yachts and mansions, but to lift up the artists he so deeply admired. He wasn't a poor artist pretending to be rich, or a rich man pretending to be poor. He was just a man, a complex, flawed, terrified man who wanted to be loved for the essence of who he was. His method had been cruel, a violation of the trust I held so sacred. But his heart, I finally realized, had been in the right place. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the fear in his eyes, the desperate hope, the love that had fueled this entire insane saga. And I made my choice. I didn't want the poor artist, and I didn't want the billionaire heir. I wanted Leo. I wanted all of him. The passion, the paranoia, the artistic soul, and the complicated, burdensome fortune. I wanted the man who bought me wildflowers from a vacant lot, and the man who could buy me a Van Gogh. I wanted to build a life with him that was honest for the first time. "I don't want you to be the poor artist," I said, my voice trembling but steady. "And I don't want you to be the Blackwood heir. I just want you, my Leo." The relief that washed over his face was so palpable, it was like a physical force. He closed the distance between us in a single stride and pulled me into his arms, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like coming home. Our new beginning wasn't a fairy tale. It was messy and complicated. We had to learn to trust again, to build a new foundation on the rubble of his deception. We didn't move into a mansion. We stayed in our apartment at first, but now it was a choice, not a necessity. We paid off my student loans, we bought a new couch, and we started to use his fortune to build the life we had always talked about, a life dedicated to art and authenticity. We traveled, not in first class, but on a shoestring, visiting small galleries and meeting artists in their studios. We used the museum as a base, a hub for a new foundation we created together, dedicated to supporting emerging artists. The trust he had broken was slowly, painstakingly rebuilt, brick by brick, with honesty and communication. There were days I still felt the sting of his lie, a phantom pain that reminded me of how close we had come to losing everything. But then I would look at him, across our dinner table or in a crowded gallery, and I would see the man I fell in love with, the man who saw the world in colors I didn't know existed. Our love story wasn't the simple, beautiful struggle I had once thought it was. It was something far more complex, far more strange, and ultimately far more real. It was a masterpiece painted on a canvas of lies, but the final picture, I realized, was the truth. And it was more beautiful than I could have ever imagined.